So we're going to start, I think, Kim, if you could sort of talk about for people about sort of the background, about uh, sort of this sort of period of time that I find very few people even notice they don't know about, which is in between the fall of the Berlin Wall and sort of the recent emergence of the EU and the expansion there. And we disregarded understanding what was happening there to our own peril, but Kim was not. So why don't you say a little bit about how you sort of decided to go there and the sort of history 101, and then we'll start talking more about Orban, the election, and what it means for all of us.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Mike. And our friendship is incredibly important to me. And it's wonderful to meet a data and democracy guy, right? Someone who is firmly anchored in the reality based world and is fighting so hard for democracy. So thank you.
Thanks.
As you hinted, I've been spending much of the last several decades actually outside the US, trying to think about the problem of collapsing democracies elsewhere in the world. I had lived and worked in Hungary in the 1990s after the wall came down at the Hungarian Constitutional Court, which was the most powerful and kind of optimistic court in the region. Hungary had this meteoric rise out of, the Soviet-inflected government into what was really a robust democracy. And like every democracy, it did good things and bad things and whatever, but it was clearly on this track to be a democratic state. It joined NATO, it joined the European Union. It had free and fair elections over and over again, peaceful rotation of power, like all the signs, that you've got democracy actually happening, right? And then the financial crisis hit. And in the financial crisis, um, it was just a perfect storm of problems. The government in power, which was sort of the left wing, by this time Hungary really had two and a half parties. The sort of left coalition had been governing when the financial crisis hit, and they had been increasing social spending. And then this crisis hit, and Hungary basically went bankrupt. And the IMF came in, did what was then its usual thing, which was you have to cut the state budget, you have to like live within your means, and put in a caretaker government, actually. And it was in that context that the election of 2010 happened. And with two and a half parties, there was the kind of left, old, tired, retread Communist Party that had become a perfectly reasonable Social Democratic Party. Orban had kind of crowded out all the parties of the center right. And then there was the neo-Nazi party. Right? And there was this little tiny Green Party, and nobody knew what it was. Those were your choices in 2010. So Orban won the vote, and frankly, at the time, I was just pleased that that the far right didn't get more votes than it did. Orban came into power. He had been prime minister once before, um, and people thought he was conservative but safe. He came into power, and again, under IMF tutelage, IMF is saying cut the budget. So he comes in, and what he's done when he was out of power is he's figured out a way to come back to power and never lose power again. And so he uses the IMF to come in, and Orban takes the state budget and he weaponizes it against anyone who could oppose the consolidation of dictatorship. This might sound a little familiar, right? So it turns out a lot of the public media and a lot of the private media were held together by state advertising and state subsidies. A lot of the NGO sector was kept alive through state subsidies. The universities, which could have been a side of opposition, had their budgets cut by 40% in the first 2 years of Orban's government. And you can go on to the ways that he strategically used the state budget. And the IMF is cheering him on, by the way, because you got to cut all this money. They weren't looking at what he was cutting the money to. And he cut the ground out from under what could have been the political opposition. And of course, in that first couple of years of Orban's government, the opposition is running around without funding and also not joining together, right? Because they think of whatever money is available. It's a zero-sum game. So the opposition splinters and starts fighting among itself for the remaining spoils. Sound familiar? And all of that Orban did at the beginning. And you could see as soon as he took office that he was heading toward trying to build a dictatorship. I'll just mention a couple of other things because they resonate so well here. Orban also suspended the civil service law, mass fired state employees, and the ones who were left were too afraid to speak out. Again, might sound a little bit familiar. Because he had not pre-packed the courts, as might have been a description here,
Right.
right? He then sets about packing the highest court first, expands the number of judges on the bench, puts on his own people. He then is going to be faced with an election. He changes the election law. In fact, I stuck in the chat a link to my article about how he changed the election law. And by 2013, so came into power in 2010. By 2013, he had captured every single important independent office in Hungary that the state, that was part of the state sector. And a dictatorship was already there. Now, it took many more years before people figured that out because he still nominally had elections, which were impossible for the opposition to win. He kept purging people who disagreed with him throughout the state sector. He would create new institutions, like a new secret police, a new academy, new university cobbled together from faculties he could trust to train his cadres. I mean, so he did all of this stuff and really very, very quickly. And let me just fast forward to 1 minute. We're in the
Yeah.
US. All of that sounds familiar, right? It's
Right.
exactly what Trump did when he first came to power and the second time, right? In last year. And it turns out that Trump was following a blueprint from Project 2025, as we all know. And I'm sure you've discussed him very
Right.
often on this chat. And so it turns out large parts of Project 2025 were written in conjunction with Orban's English language think tank called the Danube Institute. They were in the guts of that heritage project, not so much on the sort of specifically U.S. policy side, but they were in the guts of the project on how do you seize power quickly. And so it's not just a fantasy to say we should be interested in Orban's Hungary. Fast forward, he's having influence here. Okay, so let me now fast forward to through 3 rigged elections. Orban
Yeah.
wins.
Actually, before you do that, Kim, I
Yeah,
think that they want to add potentially some other um, elements of it that I've been get don't get surfaced enough. I think. See if you
yeah,
agree. One is the way in which there's a continuity between Putin, Orban, now Trump, in terms of the othering and creating sort of a moral panic around issues around gender and sexuality, and because Orban seems to have more concern for more interest in being seen as a thought leader, the articulation of this idea of illiberal democracy, that I think is an important layer to it too, that because it, I think, has a lot of important analogies here as well.
yeah. No, absolutely. So, I mean, I do think that creating a moral panic is a big part of the of the playbook. What I was struck by, however, was how little of the moral panic, for that matter, either in Russia or in Hungary. I should say I've also lived and worked in Russia for a long period of time.
Yeah,
Um, the moral panic is designed to be a TV moral panic and to pull out, like on the gender stuff. I mean, to pull out a
yeah,
few organizations or a few people to go after. But it doesn't go very far after that. So just let me give you one example. So Orban's been Mr. Anti-Gender. And here's where I should also say, one of the other things I did in the 1990s was to start the first ever gender studies department at Central European University. And those of you who've been following know that the Central European University was pushed out of Hungary a few years ago. But also, Orban shut down all the gender studies programs that we had created from the 90s on in Hungary. Of course, Putin is also, flagging all the anti-gay stuff. I mean, they banned the Pride Parade and they've legislated, against gay rights and so on. Um, but that said, I'll just tell you what Orban did. One of Orban's closest friends, and in fact, the guy who was the architect of Orban's legal capture, because Orban rewrote the constitution in the first year too, and passed, hundreds of thousands of pages of new laws that cemented his power in bylaw. Okay, that's the secret to Orban's success. Who reads those? That it would how to put it, uncovering what Orban did would be like sitting around and reading the Federal Register here in the US, right? Endless, boring, like legal announcements. But that's actually what I was doing because I had worked in the court. I could read Hungarian legalese. So what you could see from that was that Orban was like consolidating power. That's where the action was. Where he wanted the attention to be was on the anti-gay campaign, the anti-immigrant campaign. You know, in this last election, it was that Ukraine was going to invade Hungary, believe it or not. After a while, you just get totally detached from any reality whatsoever. But the key architect of Orban's legal program was a guy called József Szájer, whom I knew because he was the first person I taught a course with when I moved to Hungary. The guy, he got an LLM from the University of Michigan. His English is very good. He's an excellent creative lawyer, but he went to the dark side of the force. Okay? He engineers the new constitution. He's one of the main people behind the system. Everybody in Hungary knew Szájer was gay. He had married a woman in order to have a cover, but and reward, Szájer got posted to Brussels in order to be able to have his life, but still defend Orban. Okay, so that's the backstory. During the pandemic, there was a ban in Brussels on having more than 6 people in a room if they weren't related. And so the Brussels police busted this party that had 30 or 40 people at the party. Turns out it was, as was later described, a gay orgy, including József Szájer. Okay, now Szájer tries to escape and he jumps out the window and he sees a drain pipe and naked, he shimmies down the drain
Oh my
pipe
God.
and he's caught at the bottom by the Belgian police who arrest him for attending a COVID party. Okay. It comes out in the Hungarian press as he gets busted for attending a gay party. Never mind, gay sex is fine in Brussels, okay? But it was all over the media that Szájer had been busted as gay. No news to any of us who knew him. But so then Szájer just like disappears, okay? But he's Orban's best friend. Orban, of course, knew that, right? And Orban was still working with him under the scenes, and now they were about to bring him back if they got through this election. But the point is, it never affected Orban's friends, and they never changed the laws that went on the books after actually the court I worked for issued a decision that required protection of gay civil unions, for example. So it was a panic campaign, but the actual people who were the targets of it were affected by, of course, all the negative hate speech. That's not an innocent act. But it didn't result in legal changes of their status until extremely recently. And people in Orban's circle, I just mentioned József because he's the one who was outed, but there are lots of gay people in Orban's circles, and everybody knows it. So, it's a
Yeah.
panic, but it's a panic without coming down on the ground in a lot of places.
Right. So go on to the
Oh,
election. Also,
yeah.
the just because of some notes I got first, you should explain how much easier it is to amend the constitution in Hungary than it is here, and it's almost the same as passing a law. It
Yeah.
seems.
Well, yeah, this is how Orban did it. So, sorry for all my tangents, but I know
Yeah. No. 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 Good.
it's just like the Sire thing just, always hits me. But anyway, so here's the thing about what Orban did to lock in his power, right? So he gets power, he writes a new constitution. The old constitutional amendment rule was that you could amend anything in the constitution with a single two-thirds vote of a unicameral parliament. Orban keeps that rule. He brings in a new constitution. The constitution, if you read it, is not terrible because he knew a lot of people would read it. But there are about 50 places in that constitution where it says, and the details will be provided by law. Okay. So then there's 3 or 4 dozen of the so-called cardinal laws, the laws singled out in the Constitution. And once they're passed, they also require a two-thirds vote to change. And since, Mike, I know you're so involved in
Yeah.
elections, let me just tell you what the Hungarian election law looks like.
Yeah.
Um,
This is really pay attention to. This
you
is
heard this story.
America. I People don't realize this, but what you're going to talk about gerrymandering, right?
The gerrymander, yeah.
What Kim's about to describe is actually America before 1960. But
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So Orban, with the support of even the opposition, comes to power. So if you don't need a parliament that's 480 some people, it's a small country. We're going to cut the size of the parliament in half, or actually, they cut it down to 199. Even the opposition votes for this. Okay. And then what happens is you have to redo the districts. The Hungarian parliament is composed of single people who were elected in single member districts and then people elected on party lists, right? So it's a little over half the single member districts. So Orban gets this great gift. Suddenly he has to redistrict the whole country. And his people know who their voters are. They've kept these illegal lists. They're called the Kubatov lists after the guy who keeps the list, knowing where their voters are. I mean, so they have quite a how to put it, quite a serious machine here. They redrew the districts and then they put the boundaries of the districts, as in go to Main Street, turn left and go down Poplar Avenue. I mean, all that in Hungarian, of course. All of that detail is in the election law. The election law is several hundred pages long by the time you outline all the borders of all the districts. And that law can only be changed with a 2/3 vote. Okay. So when I talk about locked down, it's like really locked down. And the election system was such that until yesterday, we actually didn't think anyone could possibly get a 2/3 majority, given the whole way the election system was set up. And I stuck in the chat earlier this article where I detail all of that, which I won't do here. And so Peter Magyar actually figured out the key to the Orban code. And basically, without going through all the legal detail, by the time Orban got finished, jerry rigging, just gerrymander was part of it. There were lots of other things he did. It turned out that votes in the rural areas were weighted about 3 times as much as a vote in the urban areas. Okay, so Peter Magyar as a challenger, he comes out of the central center right of the spectrum. So don't expect huge policy changes in a progressive direction now, but still comes out of Orban's machine. He understands that the only way to win the election is to win rural votes. So he decides he can count on the cities, that those are more progressive. They all want Orban gone. The progressives in the cities held their nose and said, okay, we see what he's doing. We're not going to raise our issues until we get through the election. So big tent strategy. Magyar spends 2 years going around to every hamlet, every village, every settlement, and talks to people in person. And his campaign pitch is, look at all of Orban's wealth, because all the people around Orban have become fantastically rich. And there were some anti-corruption campaigners that had pictures. So for example, just to give you one picture, there's this wonderful Ákos Harlázy, who's one of these anti-corruption campaigners. And there's this estate being built just outside of Budapest that nominally belongs to Orban's dad. Okay, we all know it's Orban's, but the legal documents are all in his father's name. Okay, so Harlázy gets a ladder, puts it on the wall, climbs up over the wall with his camera, and what he sees, and it's unclear whether it's an Orban's property or his neighbor's property, who's also a wealthy fan of Orban's. He sees a flock. I don't know what the right collective noun is. He sees a flock of zebras. And a whole private zoo. So he takes the pictures of the zebras. Okay. And this has become the symbol of corruption. So Peter Magyar could go around and do like zebras. Like, do you have enough money to buy a zebra? And the answer was, of course, no. After the pandemic, Orban mismanaged the economy. He'd been mismanaging all along, but it caught up with him. Inflation soared to more than 20%. Prices were just out of control. In the meantime, for other reasons, and this is the part I worked on, the EU decided that the corruption in Hungary was so massive that they cut at first 32 billion euro to Hungary. Perfect storm joins, and it's an economic catastrophe, and the economy is in free fall. Peter Magyar can campaign, Orban is so corrupt that he's taking public money that belongs to you, putting it in private pockets, and that was the campaign.
Yeah.
And if I can just say, to go back to the gerrymandering, since Mike, I know you're the numbers guy, basically he realized that if you get the votes from the countryside as opposed to amassing the votes from the cities, you tip over Orban's system, and then you benefit from this tipping effect that happens. It's not a proportional representation system. And there's a point, and we didn't know exactly where that point was, where if you get enough countryside votes, the whole system flips to you. Okay. And that's what happened yesterday. Peter Magyar got 54% of the vote. Fidesz, Orban's party, got about 39%. And 54% was enough, given where it was concentrated, to give him 69% of the seats in the parliament. So he walked right into Orban's system, figured out how it worked, got those rural votes, and then won big.
Right. No, it really is, I think, hard for people in America who are so conditioned by one person, one vote, to realize that what Jim is saying, but also that until Reynolds versus Sims in 1964, which was bit over, I think, Alabama's districting, where you had 25% of the voters electing over half the legislature. And like no surprise, which 25% of Alabama was electing 50% of the state legislature. And since then, America's been, that's one thing. It actually sort of gets at sort of how America's had to innovate its gerrymandering after that, because unable to rely on, like, you know, baby election stealing of just, giving, just disproportionate districts. It's had to draw the lines in a way to accomplish the same kind of thing. Um, so why don't a lot of people are asking? I think it's really
Now what?
interesting. Yeah. Now what? And who is, like, more
Yeah.
than understanding, like, how to find zebras? What do we like?
How do we unravel this? Okay, so the first thing is that the fact that Peter Magyar won the 69% of the seats means he can change the Constitution. He can change any law. What Orban had been counting on was that any opponent, if they could work their way through this labyrinth of Orban's rigged elections, would only get a simple majority, and then the Orban machine could just block them. This puts Orban's machine in more trouble, but it's not without power. Okay, so the first thing is that it's a parliamentary system, so the parliament elects the prime minister. The prime minister will be Peter Magyar. However, there's also a president elected by the parliament, and that's Tamás Hulyar. He's a Fidesz guy. All the laws that get passed by the parliament can get vetoed by the president. And this is what we saw in Poland, where the pro-democratic forces won the election. They still had this autocratic president, and he's vetoed everything. Then they look hopeless and they lose. I'm worried they're going to lose the next election. Okay. In Hungary, same problem. You've got this president who's a veto player. You've also got a packed constitutional court. So if you try to do things through executive orders or things that don't actually need presidential approval, the constitutional court will get those cases and probably block. So think of yourself as being parked in a park. The parked cars around you all moved you into the space where you can't get out of the parking space. Okay, so what can he do? There's a couple things he can do that we can't do here, but let me just tell you what they are. Hungary is part of the European Union. Okay? The European Union has something called the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Hungary has refused to join it. What it does is it gives you, here's a prosecution team, not from your own prosecutor's office, which is also captured in Hungary. Here's a prosecution team. We will go in and look for the corruption of EU funds. And Peter Magyar said he'd join that day one. So the anti-corruption investigations can start immediately. And that's good. And they're not under Orban's control. So that's one thing. But what are the things you can do if you don't have the EU kind of coming in and helping you? Okay. So here's where I think Peter Magyar has messaged this very well. He said last night in his acceptance speech, here are the people that are part of Orban's system. And actually, he uses this interesting word in Hungarian, like in the US language, you say the Trump administration, right? In Hungarian, you say the Orban government. That's kormány, which it means government. The word that Magyar has always used to describe the Orban system is Orban rendszer, which means Orban order, system, like locked
Right.
in place, okay? And so in his acceptance speech, he said, we will dismantle the Orban rendszer, and that must start with the president resigning and with a number of offices, and he named them by name, resigning because you no longer have democratic legitimacy. So let's see. I mean, I don't think they're going to resign, okay? But the first thing is to just single them out and start to get these crowds pressure, right, on them to delegitimate their offices and to delegitimate what they're doing. And hopefully then they will pass laws that permit this change to happen. Let's see. If the change is blocked, then one of the things they can do is to try to just say, we're not going to rely on the president's signature. It's illegitimate, so we're going to treat this as law. See if they can get the PAC courts to do it. I mean, it's going to be a very complicated unwinding, but they have the moral authority. Peter Maudier campaigned on exactly dismantling this stuff. And he thinks so far that he can actually fire current incumbents. So just one thing about how Orban did that, if I can say, because Orban came in, also passed all these new laws, with a president from the opposite camp, and then managed to fire them all. So how did he do that? I'll give you one example. Orban took control of the Supreme Court, renamed it the Curia, which had been the medieval name of, and he does all this history stuff. Okay. So he renamed it, said it's a new institution. All the judges currently on the Supreme Court can reapply for their jobs over there, but that court's going to sunset and the new one will take off. And then he put in new criteria for the judges to meet. And when the old judges applied to the new court, some of them were disqualified, particularly the president of the court, who was the one he wanted to get rid of. Okay. So you can do that. You develop a shadow institution, you move people there and disqualify the ones on the way. And there were some other things. He's fired people, built up, like imaginary for-cause firing and so on. So Peter Maudier could just redo the Orban playbook, frankly. And I think he's going to give everyone a chance to move over to the pro-democratic side. And if they don't, then I think it's Orban playbook.
Yeah. Maybe, so in the realm of the fantasy, but maybe if a Democrat wins in 2028, they can ask like Thomas and Barrett and Kavanaugh and Roberts to resign and apply for their job again.
Yeah, but there's other creative things you can do, right? I mean,
that'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah, we could play like fantasy football with how do you rearrange American institutions. There's some creative proposals out there, right? Like what the Constitution says is there shall be one Supreme Court, and it shall have the following original jurisdiction. And after that, Congress sets up the courts. That's basically what it says, right? So what Congress could do is say, yes, we have one Supreme Court. There it is. And it has this original jurisdiction, period. It cannot hear any other cases. Right. And then build another court below that court that hears all the other cases that the Supreme Court now hears. I don't see a constitutional violation in that one, right? So we got to get creative about this stuff.
Right. No, I think that's actually gets at the heart of what has been so problematic is the way in which the just how expansive the Roberts Court has seen its purview, and in ways that certainly are not grounded in the Constitution any more than the immunity decision.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So this is where I fight with my law colleagues, right? So I'm really a law professor in my ordinary life. What you learn as an American lawyer is to look at the Supreme Court and aim everything you do at possible acceptance by that court. Okay. But this has really been a packed court. I know, Mike, you and I, in fact, our early days of friendship where I was trying to say, you were looking at turnout. I was saying, look at the legal system, right? And here we are looking at both. But anyway, I mean, so we have to think about this court as a packed court. Many of my law colleagues are still waiting for the National Guard decision, the tariffs case, birthright citizenship to prove and to turn to me and say, look at this. I mean, you don't have a packed court. They're ruling against Trump. Okay, so here's your user's guide to how to recognize a packed court. Okay. If you have a packed court that is packed in order to support a dictator, the line of cases that matter the most for that project are the line of cases about executive power. And look at what the Supreme Court has done on all of the cases that deal with, can the president just dissolve agencies set up by Congress? Can he fire pretty much anyone he wants, except at the Fed? Can he ignore civil service laws and mass fire civil servants? Can he refuse to spend money that Congress has appropriated? All of those things are executive power aggrandizement, getting Congress out of the way. The Congress cannot legislate to constrain the president. And of course, there was that grand immunity decision before Trump took office. All of that is executive power consolidation. kneecapping Congress. And also, this court, the Supreme Court, has been kneecapping the lower courts. Think about the injunctions case. Think about all of the ways in which they'll take a 150-page reasoned factual judgment sustaining an injunction, and the court says, nah, the president might be harmed by not being able to carry out his policy, so let him go ahead. That avenue, there is not a single case where the Supreme Court has strayed from the project of executive power consolidation. That's the PAC part. So then how do we explain these other parts? Well, the two courts I used to work in, I worked at the Hungarian Constitutional Court for 4 years and then at the Russian Constitutional Court for 1 year. They're PAC courts. I follow them pretty closely. And they're like a broken watch, right, wrong, right, twice a day.
Right.
And so they will always rule against the government on certain things to keep the legal profession on board in thinking that there's still a court there and not just a executive agency, right? So when do they rule against the executive? I can tell you 3 points. Point 1, when the executive has walked himself into a cul-de-sac and has changed his mind and doesn't know how to get out. The court says what you've done is unlawful. The executive thankfully says, yes, I will follow your decision. Think National Guards, right? How was Trump going to pull the National Guards out of Los Angeles and Chicago after they had clearly stopped doing what they needed to do? The court waited long enough for those National Guards to become inconvenient for Trump and then ruled he had to pull them out. And then he said, fine, I'll follow it. Okay, that's example 1. Example 2, PAC courts will rule against the executive where in order to, again, keep the legal profession on board at a time when what they're prohibiting is something that the president is allowed to do through other means. Okay? See tariffs. Okay? They waited, they heard the oral argument. People were saying, why are they waiting so long to decide? It looked like they were going to knock down the tariffs that had been imposed under the International Economic Emergency Protection or whatever, IEPA, that law. I always forget what it stands for. Okay, so they got rid of the universal injunctions, but it took several months. And I was following this. You look at China, you look at the UK, you look at the EU, you look at Canada, all the cases that he was talking about. The executive branch had already taken the tariffs out from under IEPA justification and had slotted them into one of the other 7, 8, 9, 10 parts of statutes that permit him to impose tariffs. So by the time the court struck down the IEPA tariffs, the only ones they were striking down were like the ones on penguins and, whatever, the ones he didn't care as much about. And he could still impose tariffs on all these other ways. Okay, so did they constrain executive power? No, they just said, don't do this, do it over here. They even told him in the decision, you can do it through all these other means. Okay, that's type 2. Finally, type 3. Type 3 is where you get like a human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights case that gets so much public attention that it would be, and where the law is so clear, that it would be scandalous for the court to suddenly change its mind. But they have to also be these kinds of constitutional rights cases that aren't really much about the centralization of executive power, okay? And in those cases, courts are willing to rule against the executive, again, to keep the legal profession on board. And I would say in that regard, think birthright citizenship, right? So I've seen this in other places, and here we are in Trump land, and that was the kind of thing, those are the kind of cases, I won't go into all the detail, although I would love to if somebody would be willing to listen, about all the Hungarian and Russian constitutional court cases that did the same. So here we are.
So actually, I think in the United States, there's a much easier way to determine whether the court is packed, which is that
Voting
the court
rights.
was packed,
Yeah.
right? That like there's an explicit project that it describes itself as needing to pack the courts, that spends billions of dollars to do it,
Well,
that mobilizes white Christian voters in the states, and it is only the presidents backed by the Federalist Society and the evangelical churches, with only the votes of the senators backed by those billionaires and theocrats who sit on the court.
right.
So I'm not sure we need to do much more parsing here.
That's true. Well, if you're in the voting rights field, this has been evident going back to Reagan, right? I mean, this is a long-term Republican project, although I must say that when the courts first started getting packed to vote Republican on every voting rights case, the kind of Republicans that might have gotten elected were conservatives, but not autocrats. And so we're in a different space now. I mean, neither is Trump conservative on that plan, actually. I mean, he's doing all kinds of stuff, right? But he's also a dictator in training, and that's really different. And he's hijacked a party that had this plan. The party is sort of still marching forward with the plan, but it has a very different output now than it would have had if you'd had, garden variety Republicans,
See, I think actually that the order is reversed. That when you're talking about the reasonable Republicans, the Republicans that were not going along with that, it wasn't like just that was a moment where like the whatever mind virus hadn't infected them. It's that the names of the Republicans you're talking about were Northern Republicans like Javits or Ribikoff, like all of those folks
yeah,
who represent people for whom what you're talking, all that, so all you're talking about was anathema, right? The key shift, right, that went from them nominating the Suitors or the Sandra Day O'Connor or right. Remember, those were people that got bipartisan support and by regional support, right? They were almost all unanimously confirmed. And that was sort of what kept a check on the court getting out of control. But what I'm saying is that like long before Trump went down the escalator, the the realignment of the party as one that really only represents the southern and western red states means that they're all down with that project, not
right,
like because they became cowards, but because that's what they believe. And that's why I think it has a lot more to do with it. But it also gets to a point that I really wanted to raise. Boy, time's flying when you have a great time. The um, but I think a problem here, and I want to get a sense of how this maps to Hungary that I really haven't seen talked about, is that the it's so easy to talk about Trump as a singular wannabe dictator and to narrate all of this in terms of the one supreme leader. But in the United States, the oligarchic power behind it is, I would argue, the actual tyrant in this country. And that and so in the United States, and I think this is a danger that um, the sort of the Big Ten coalitions have to guard against, is that there are many who are ready to be done with Trump, but not with like the basic authoritarian version of the United States, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so beyond the story you were telling of what Orban can do, right? There are obviously the interests in Hungary who like have a lot at stake as well. And so like how can they gum this up as opposed to just, like Orban as a human?
yeah. Well, one of the differences, between Hungary and the US is that when Orban came to power, Hungary had very few oligarchs. It wasn't Russia, it wasn't
Right.
Bulgaria, it wasn't some of the other states that had really gone wild with having a huge inequality. Hungary was relatively equal. What the Orban government did, instead of being captured by oligarchs, Orban created the oligarchs. He built an oligarchic network out of giving them state contracts and out of giving them, essentially state money. It was a kleptocratic regime that just funneled
Right.
money into private pockets. But he picked the oligarchs. Okay, now in the US, you've got an oligarchic class that has, I'm not sure it picked Trump out of a lineup, but it was happy to get on board with Trump.
Right. I
And
think that's
Trump is
right.
mercenary enough to accept the favors, and he wants to be one of them, right? So they glommed onto Trump. They've been holding him up. It's the, tech bros and others. And this is actually very difficult because in the US, like in Hungary, the state really is like, there's this political science literature on what's called a resource curse. If you've got oil or whatever, there are very few countries that are oil-producing countries, and I think we're falling into this now, where you actually can retain democracy. Because if you've got one huge source of money, what tends to happen is the state captures it, and then democracy's over. It's called the resource curse. So the problem in a country like Hungary is that you've got a resource curse. Like the state is the source of all the money, and the EU funds coming to Hungary were the main available funds for economic development in the country. So everybody gathers around the state looking for it to hand out the goodies, right? The way you hang around the oil
Right.
pipelines and wait for that to generate wealth. And so Orban picked his oligarchs. Okay, so and now the oligarchs are can operate and screw up the Magyar regime. You know, he doesn't control the oligarchs that Orban built, and Orban was smart enough before this election. Orban's a belt and suspenders guy. Okay, so before this election, he was planning something in case he lost. They just went through this massive privatization of the defense industry in Hungary, just as the EU is about to slosh 17 billion euro into that little economy. And his cronies are going to be fine. Okay. That's a different dynamic than here, right? Here, the oligarchs pick their government and
Right.
they're keeping him in place and they're funding him. The corruption is benefiting them all. Who knows who's benefiting from all the stock market leaps and the poly markets and everything else, right? And the crypto stuff, right? There's just massive, massive corruption going on. Um, the only good thing about that here is that it's actually not as easy to hide the corruption here as it was in Hungary. Now it's all exposed in Hungary, but for the first 10 years of Orban's government, it was hard to document exactly how all that worked. Okay, so here you can see people just getting so incredibly wealthy and just dominating everything, which is why you're seeing a growing. I mean, it used to be just the kind of the really progressive left of the Democrats that were really in favor of wealth taxes and, you know, taxing these giant pools of money. That's been moving. You'll know better than I, but my sense is that there's now just a lot more people on board with that as a political program, which also means the oligarchs are going to work harder to fight it, right? So trying to figure out how you disentangle political and economic power in this country is really a problem. Let me just say one more thing because we tend to have these
Yeah.
discussions in national bubbles, right? And you know, I'm always the one who pushes you, Mike, to think about the rest of the world, right? I mean, Elon Musk has who knows how many passports, and you know he stashed a lot of his wealth outside the U.S. economy. I mean, if the U.S. economy goes down, it'll take a lot with it, but I'm sure that most of these oligarchs don't actually depend on the US economy staying level and being something that can support the average American. They just take off, right? I mean, Elon Musk is talking about Mars. That's a little way off. But, you know, all these folks have their wealth stashed in ways that will protect them from a crash of the US economy. So therefore, they're willing to roll the dice with the US economy and bring it all down with the rest of us. So that's really a serious issue with this particular oligarchic class.
Yeah. And I think, the famous quote from Louis Brandeis that you can have concentrated wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And I think people like who are probably on the Substack and people like in who we know, like all go there. I think the problem is that that's actually what the oligarchs believe, right? And that instead of thinking of it as an argument for democracy,
Right.
right, it is a realization that they can't have their concentrations of great wealth if they allow democracy.
Right. But remember that
Mm.
one of the ways that the oligarchs will always beat the Democrats is that the oligarchs are playing on a transnational chessboard, right? And the Democrats are not. I mean, not just because they're not learning lessons from what's happening elsewhere, that's
Right,
one thing, but because the democracy is necessarily a self-contained unit. People are in and people are
right,
out. You can't just move it to wherever, right? You couldn't move American democracy to Hungary, for example. So the oligarchs will always have the upper hand because they can always escape any particular government that tries to pin them down. They can move their wealth, they can move whatever, you know, and so all of that is just, that just puts them at an advantage over what's happening in democratic spaces. And so this is where I want to say, the MAGA folks got trained in Budapest. This might sound like a deviation, but it's not. Orban invented, Orban was spending 1% of Hungarian GDP, which actually was a lot of money, on a whole network of think tanks, boot camps, etc., to train not only his own cadres, but the whole global far right. And a lot of the MAGA people passed through Orban's think tank called the Danube Institute, which was involved right in writing Project 2025. One of the people who hung out for 2 years at the Danube Institute was a guy called Chris Rufo, who has, been trying to destroy the American education system, following on what Orban did. So there is a global network now of anti-democrats who pick up ideas, learn from each other. And there is sort of a global network of Democrats, but everybody is working on elections in their own national space. And because election systems differ so much country to country, it's been hard for the pro-Democrats to figure out how to share tips. But we need to look outside the country to figure out what goes wrong, what goes right, how can we take advantage of those lessons? And we need to play on a global chessboard as well, in order to be able to get those insights and strengthen democracy from what's happened to the crashed ones and what's happening now to the recovering ones.
It's not surprisingly, it's we could do this for quite a bit longer, but to try to also bring it back to killing democracy by law and what you're saying about the transnational and such. I think there's that the Biden years and to right here just focus on the tech oligarchs.
Yeah.
I think it shows us something that makes it even more difficult than you just described, in the sense that all except for Peter Thiel and a few others, right? They were all completely on board with keeping Trump from overturning the 2020 election, and I think we're fine not to have him.
Right, to
But I
jump on
think
off platforms, and we
right.
forget.
I think one really important development during the Biden years was the the beginning of the I don't know if conversation, but really working with the EU
Yeah.
to come together to better regulate the platforms
Yeah.
and begin to develop a regime for AI.
Yeah.
And I think that was enough to change their interests in the way that we just saw.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the trap we're in, right? In these sort of big tent coalitions with big corporate interests,
Yeah.
is that they're there only so long as it doesn't lead to any constraint on what they're doing.
Right.
And and that's a problem that hasn't been solved.
Yeah, it's a problem that hasn't been solved. But here's the thing, the EU was strong enough to stand up to the platforms. The Trump administration is now thinking about sanctioning the EU for standing up to platforms, as indeed they
Well, that's what I'm
sanctioned.
saying. It's why? Because they're the part.
They're
I mean,
relevant.
that's
Yeah, but the
yeah,
EU, it's interesting. What happened, and this is actually Orban had a role in this. I mean,
yeah.
I specialize in Hungary. I see Orban everywhere, right? But here's one thing I know he did. In the last European elections, there's a parliament of the EU, okay? And Orban used money from his network of think tanks and so on to buy advertising on social media in all the countries of the EU where there were these far right parties. The biggest advertiser in the European elections was Orban's propaganda machine. And he supported those parties, and people were surprised at their success. He then called in his chips and brought these parties together and was able to form the third largest party in the European Parliament.
Um,
Okay, so the EU saw that, and then they came in with this regulation, no political advertising on platforms. The Patriots for Europe, which is the name of Orban's party, believe it or not, all
yeah,
these right-wing parties have parties that are the opposite of what they stand for, just so you
right.
know, like the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Yeah, just the opposite. Okay, so here we have the Patriots. They are not Patriots for Europe, which is their name.
Yeah,
They're the Eurosceptics who want to crash it except to get the money. So They were not going to go along, but there were enough votes to pass this that just, I think it was a few months ago, this law came into effect, and suddenly Orban's main mechanism for influencing people at home was to do all this Facebook advertising, because Hungarians are all on Facebook, and he couldn't do it. So he tried to get his followers to substitute and like do all the disinformation stuff. The problem is, like most of these right-wing groups, their followers are by and large people without higher education. Trying to get them to do a bot, or to do
Right.
advertising, and it didn't work. So in the last month, Orban called in Putin's disinformation team that had swayed the Moldovan election, actually.
Yeah.
And they showed up in Budapest and they went to work for Orban. And the Magyar camp was ready, to hit those bots with all kinds of flags and whatever. I mean, it was really interesting. The Magyar campaign was so savvy. Okay, but the reason for telling you all of this
Yeah.
is that the EU has been trying to tame the platforms. And they've been doing it in a way that so far the platforms haven't fought back against that stuff. I mean, really, are they going to go to the mat for political advertising during election campaigns? No, there's a much bigger thing at stake, right? So there may be ways to regulate these platforms to preserve the democratic space without taking away all their goodies so that they then bring down hell and, fire and brimstone on all of our heads, right? So anyway, I mean, it's a challenge. And this is where if democracies work together, right? These are transnational
Right.
platforms. They just move their headquarters to another country and then, work from there. So, that said, if I can just put in one pitch,
Yeah.
the reason
Sure.
why the Hungarian election could be just massively changed the way it was because the opposition used the internet. Okay. Orban controls all the TV stations, all the radio stations, almost all the platforms, and all the billboards, which you see when you go for an election campaign. What did the opposition do? They developed a YouTube channel that's operating like their television channel. There's a streaming radio service when their last radio station lost its frequency. They have several online news platforms, and they've been able to have their journalists live in the neighboring countries where they're not immediately under Orban's
Right.
jurisdiction and pop into Hungary or to zoom into Hungary or to use Signal or other encrypted
Right.
communications to go into Hungary and do their investigative reports. So the opposition relied heavily on the internet. So we have to be careful not to kill the one thing that enables an opposition to survive while we're regulating it. Right. So it's a hard trick, but it's really crucial that you point that out.
It is. Well, time has flown. It's so great having you on. I'm sure you're on to your next thing now,
Yeah.
and hope you get a
One
chance
day
to.
everybody pays attention to
Yeah.
Hungary. So happy to talk about it. And Hungary's gonna be with us still. I think a lot of your listeners were asking, how do we undo
Yeah.
a dictatorship? And I'd love to keep you informed on that when we see how Peter Magyar tries.
Absolutely.
Yeah. U-turns are
All
not
right.
easy, as they say. Yeah.
Great.
This is great.
Take care.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks to everybody for showing up. Watch Hungary.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.